There's a bit of controversy surrounding Market Garden, and I want your opinions on it, because strategically speaking, what was the purpose of Market Garden? Was it striking into the Ruhr? Well, Monty says that it was in his memoirs. He says that the purpose of Market Garden was to get across the Rhine and then to strike into the Ruhr, or onwards to Berlin. And he thinks this is a single thrust strategy, etc., etc. Now, this idea actually isn't realistic and isn't what the purpose of Market Garden was. So let me explain. The objective of Market Garden was to get across the Rhine and reach the Zuiderzee. The Zuiderzee. So that's a little bit different. The Ruhr's over here, and yet we're striking towards the Zuiderzee, the body of water over here in the Netherlands or in Holland. What is this? Why is this the case? And that was the stated goal, the tactical goal of Market Garden, was to get across the Rhine with 3 airborne divisions, take Drielen Airfield, how you say it, and put in the 51st Lowland Division in this area, and then 30 Corps was going to strike towards the Zuiderzee and create a corridor roughly like so. So, if that's the stated objective of Market Garden, where's this thrust into the Ruhr coming from? Well, the fact is there isn't one, at least not in the way that Montgomery's laying it out. So Montgomery is saying that the idea was to get to the Ruhr. Eisenhower believed that the purpose of Market Garden was to get the 15th Army here out of the Scheldt Estuary, which is this area here. Because Antwerp, which you can just about see here, this little town over here, was captured. It's a port. It was captured intact, surprisingly. And the problem was that the Germans still held the water between Antwerp and the North Sea, which meant that supplies couldn't come from London, etc., through Antwerp and then into the armies, but had to go through Cherbourg and Normandy, all this way. And the supply situation by the Allied armies was critical, so when they got to this point, they were running out of supplies. They had to stop. So Eisenhower wanted the capture of the Scheldt Estuary and the capture of the island, especially, I think it was this one, Walcheren or something. He wanted that as a priority to get the port of Antwerp in working order so that supplies could come through to the Allied armies. That was what Eisenhower wanted, but agreed to Market Garden because this would do a couple of things. And he says this in his memoirs. So, one, if this line is taken, if Market Garden succeeds, and this area is taken, if I just draw this correctly, then what happens here? What does this do? What does this allow? Well, this allows, if you look at it, the 15th Army to be almost surrounded in this area here. Now, it wouldn't have been completely surrounded because there is a land bridge here. I forget the name of it. Lord Cucumber talked about this, and I might link to his video in the description. But yeah, the 15th Army is now cut off from Germany and would be unable to receive reinforcements directly this way and supplies, which would have meant that the Canadians striking in from the south here would have had an easier time taking the Scheldt Estuary, which would mean that supplies could get through Antwerp quicker. So the purpose of Market Garden seems to be, in Eisenhower's point of view, and in a lot of, in my point of view as well, seems to be to cut off the 15th Army and allow it to be destroyed, and thus allow Antwerp to be opened, rather than directly attacking this way directly and taking the Scheldt directly, which would have been difficult, and was indeed difficult because it cost a lot of lives in reality. It may have been possible to reduce the effectiveness of the 15th Army by striking this way, getting to the Zuiderzee and cutting them off from their supply base, and possibly even surrounding them and maybe even attacking them this way as well. And that seems like a very realistic goal when you look at this, because again, it's aiming the opposite way of the Ruhr. It's not going into the Ruhr. I mean, it might in 1945 allow a thrust into the Ruhr, and Eisenhower even says that as a bridgehead, but his stated goal for Market Garden was this, to take the Scheldt Estuary. So why then is Monty saying the Ruhr? Well, when you read his memoirs, it's quite obvious, and I think quite interesting, that he's obviously trying to bend the truth about certain points. So throughout the chapter that he mentions Market Garden, he's literally, pretty much everything he's saying is literally aimed at blaming Supreme Headquarters and Eisenhower. Although he says he's not doing that. He actually says he's not doing that, which indicates that he is. He's laying the blame throughout at Supreme Headquarters. He's saying that he wasn't given logistical priority, when in fact he was. He actually, at one point, and I find this really silly, the 1st Canadian Army is roughly around here. You have the British, I think it's 2nd Army around this area, and you've got the 1st Canadian Army, which is around about here. You've got a Czechoslovakian 1st Armoured Brigade surrounding Dunkirk, which is quite interesting in itself. But the 1st Canadians are here, and their objective is to take the Scheldt, which is fine. But he actually lays blame at the failure of taking the Scheldt Estuary on the 1st Canadian Army, because he says that the Canadians are to blame for not being able to clear the Scheldt whilst Market Garden was underway. But the fact remains that the Canadians didn't actually start their attack until after Market Garden, so how could they be blamed for not taking the Scheldt at the same time? It doesn't make any sense. What Montgomery is saying doesn't make any sense, and it's obvious that he's lying. He's trying to blame other people, and he does admit some of the blame himself, but he blames everything. He blames the weather for the failure of Market Garden. He doesn't blame the forces directly under his control, which is interesting considering the Polish commander, Sosabowski, got fired for the failure of Market Garden, even though they only played a minor role effectively and actually saved 1st Airborne from complete destruction. So that's not fair. But he doesn't even blame the Poles. You think, oh, it was a Polish commander whose fault it was. It doesn't stand up. And obviously he's writing his memoirs after the war, so he's had time to think about this. But everything he's saying is trying to blame everyone else, especially Supreme Headquarters and Eisenhower, even though he states that this is not the case. And as I say, he does accept some of the blame himself, but only on minor issues, really, not actually on the fact that, he's blaming Supreme Headquarters. And because I can see that Monty's lying, and it's quite obvious, I'm more inclined to believe that the purpose of Market Garden wasn't actually, in fact, the Ruhr, but was an indirect method of attacking the 15th Army and clearing the Scheldt. Because it makes sense. Student's 1st Army, which wasn't even really an army, let's put it that way, consisted of a bunch of hastily formed Fallschirmjäger and Eisener's battalions. There did happen to be, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, whatever it was, up here with the 2 SS Panzer divisions, but they were resting and refitting at Arnhem and weren't actually at the front line. And Student's army wasn't effectively that good, so it makes sense that the thrust at Arnhem was designed to strike at a weak point in the enemy's line, get to the Zuiderzee, cut the 15th Army off from supplies and reinforcements, allowing them to be defeated easier by the Canadians, and of course outflanked by 2 British corps here, although I think 30 Corps would have been stuck holding this line, that the other corps may have been able to assist the Canadians. And then clear the Scheldt Estuary indirectly. And I do think that was the primary purpose of Market Garden. Eisenhower kind of says that's the case. In fact, if I just read the point, on the 10th of September, which was 7 days before Market Garden began, Eisenhower says, I instructed Montgomery, he says him, but Montgomery means, I instructed Montgomery that what I did want in the north was Antwerp working, and I also wanted a line covering that port, basically outflanking the port. Beyond this, I believed it possible that we might, with an airborne assistance, seize a bridgehead over the Rhine in the Arnhem region, flanking the defences of the Siegfried Line. And he goes on to say it's not more than a bridgehead. It's not. He actually says at one point a single thrust towards Berlin was just not possible, which is what Montgomery apparently wanted. That wasn't possible. That wasn't on the cards. Eisenhower is saying that this is the priority because he wants Antwerp working so that supplies can come through. And he goes on to say, where is it? Yeah, after the completion of the bridgehead operation, Market Garden, Montgomery was to turn instantly and with his whole force to the capture of Walcheren Island, which I think is this one again, and the other areas in which the Germans were defending the approaches to Antwerp. That was the priority. Montgomery dismisses this claim in his memoirs, but again, it's obvious that he's lying when he's doing it, or he's at least bending the truth. He says that his instructions, his orders to his troops, which he then submitted to Eisenhower, had said nothing about the Antwerp, freeing up Antwerp, except for the Canadians. He mentioned the Canadians were going to do it, but nobody else was to assist, and therefore he is exempt from. He was under the impression that Antwerp wasn't the priority, and Market Garden was stated aim was to get over into the Ruhr and perhaps Berlin. But again, that's not really. It's not backed up. It doesn't make any sense. If that was the case, then why didn't he aim Market Garden directly towards the Ruhr? I mean, if you think about it, if he was going to go this way, he could have actually got this far. It just doesn't add up. Something's not right in Montgomery's claims. But I do think a successful Market Garden could have been possible. As I said in my documentary, I think it was a failure in a few areas. Perhaps the Nijmegen Bridge, perhaps the fact that the airborne division was so far away, and all that. But a successful Market Garden was certainly possible, and even though it wouldn't have ended the war by Christmas, it would have meant a clearing of the 15th Army quicker, perhaps, easier, perhaps, less casualties, perhaps, and it would have meant that there was going to be a bridgehead, in which case the British Army, and with the support of the Commonwealth, would have been able to get into the Ruhr a little bit easier, and supplies would have trickled down to the troops down here, making their attacks a little bit easier. And I do think that was possible. Now, somebody pointed out that the Germans may have counterattacked this area rather than, the Battle of the Bulge, aiming towards Antwerp. That instead of the Battle of the Bulge happening down there, the Germans may have counterattacked at the Arnhem area, and I'm certain that would have happened. But I don't think that would have been the priority, because Antwerp was the stated goal of the Ardennes offensive. And it doesn't make sense that they would change this, because if they still did that, they would have surrounded the British anyway. So I don't think, maybe it would have been maybe even a major attack over here, but I think the priority probably would have still been Antwerp for the Ardennes offensive. So I don't know about that, but obviously going into the alternative history, but immediately you can see the benefit of Market Garden surrounding the 15th Army and clearing the Scheldt Estuary, because in fact clearing the Scheldt Estuary was incredibly difficult. But again, I'd love to hear your opinions on all this. And this is the point I want to make about this as well. This is where analysing sources is quite vital for history, because if you just relied on one source, Montgomery's source, you kind of get the impression that, yes, the Ruhr is where I'm going for. But if you read Eisenhower's source, and then you look at Montgomery's from a critical eye, even Eisenhower's from a critical eye, you kind of get the impression that actually maybe that's not the case. Now, you guys reading these sources may see it from a different point of view. So if you've read both Eisenhower and Montgomery sources, or you're going to, let me know what you think. But going off, and this is interesting as well, the last point I'll make, going off what both authors say, the tragedy for the whole of this, whether a market garden would have succeeded or not, the tragedy, and I'll use a different colour, is that regardless of whether market garden would have succeeded or not, there's a good portion of Holland up here still left in German hands. And the tragedy is that the hunger winter would still have happened regardless of a successful market garden or not. And millions of people and thousands of people, well, millions of people would have starved and thousands of people would have died regardless of whether market garden would have succeeded or not. And that is supported by both what Montgomery says and what Eisenhower says, because neither of them were aiming to take the northern part of Holland in their memoirs. I'll leave it there. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye for now.